So we saw in the previous video how Hitler had managed to come to power as Chancellor. That is, because the Nazi Party was the largest political party by 1932, it was able to form, or it was invited by conservatives to form a coalition with Hitler as Chancellor. And the hope amongst the German conservatives was that once Hitler was in power, he could be controlled, he could be modified, his kind of aggressive politics would be more muted with the burden of responsibility upon him. Obviously, that was not to be the case. What's interesting in comparing the rise of Hitler and Mussolini is that it really took Mussolini 3 years from his appointment as prime minister to really ensconce himself as dictator in Italy. It took Hitler 3 months. He moved at a much more rapid pace. So one of the reasons was he was able to take advantage of a fire that broke out in the German Reichstag, German Parliament, in early February 1933. Hitler, in response to this, issued an emergency decree. So basically passed a law saying that because of this emergency crisis, our state is under attack, someone has burned our Parliament building, all civil liberties are to be suspended. It was supposed to be a temporary measure, and it actually remained in place until 1945 in the fall of the Nazis. Historians have debated about whether the fire was genuinely something that was... so the person blamed for the fire was a Dutch communist who was beheaded shortly afterwards. Historians are not sure whether this was this person genuinely did this and the Nazis simply took advantage of the crisis, or whether they staged the entire thing in the first place precisely so they could remove civil liberties. So, but by March 1933, Hitler suspended most civil liberties. The Nazis then also called an election in March 1933, in which they expect to win an overwhelming majority of the votes. And they do get some gain, but they only win 44% of the votes. And that's the last time they try and host open elections. And even then, the elections weren't all that open in terms that the Nazis put a great deal of pressure on people to vote for the Nazis. But even then, they didn't get an overall majority. And it's worth that bearing in mind when we talk about German culpability for the rise of the Nazis, that even at their height, in terms of reasonably open elections, they never actually won a majority amongst the German people. Although later on, as the Nazi policy seemed to be successful, certainly support for the Nazis amongst Germans does grow. So by May, the Nazis had seized control of all banks, of all newspapers, and it also began cracking down on trade unions in particular. They saw trade unions rightly as being sympathetic to communism, and they saw communists as the enemy of the Nazi state. And it's worth bearing in mind that as the Nazi support was rising amongst German voters, so too was support for the German Communist Party. So trade unions were closed down, their leaders were arrested, the Nazi state seized control of all newspapers and of the financial industry as well, and was essentially taking control of all aspects of German society. And by July, they had more or less completed the process. So in July 1933, all political parties were banned. Bear in mind, it took Mussolini 6 years to do the same thing in Italy. All state governments were forced under Nazi control. So Germany is a federal republic like the United States, in that it's made up of a series of states with an overall federal government. The Nazis initially won control of the federal government, and then once they had control of that, they abolished basically state parliaments and appointed Nazi governors to run these states instead. So very, very quickly, the Nazis are able to roll up all the kind of institutions of democratic government and ensure that all power is concentrated in the hands of Hitler. So, and that's what this cartoon is supposed to symbolize here, essentially that those who resisted found that they were quite quickly forced to comply at gunpoint. One of the big threats to Hitler, however, was Ernst Röhm. If you remember, Ernst Röhm was the founder of the SA, the Sturmabteilung, the Nazi stormtroopers that had helped Hitler rise to power in the 1920s. As the Nazi Party became the only political party in Germany, more and more people were forced out of necessity to join the Nazi Party. And Ernst Röhm became concerned that the original Nazis, the guys who had been with Hitler from the beginning, like Röhm himself, were in danger of being kind of pushed out of power or kind of losing their influence over Hitler. And so by 1934, Röhm was kind of talking to people about the possibility of the need for another revolution. In other words, potentially using his own armed paramilitaries to attack the German state. The German army hated the SA, they hated Röhm and his influence. They saw Röhm as a threat to their power. And by June 1934, Hitler decided to act against Röhm. So what became known as the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler had Röhm and about 80 of his enemies rounded up and executed without any kind of due process. So he seizes the opportunity of suppressing Röhm with settling scores with other political enemies as well, and eliminating any potential opposition to him in the form of the SA. The last kind of outpost of power that did not lay in the hands of the Nazis was the presidency, the president of the German Republic. That was Paul von Hindenburg, who was a German general, a successful German general during the First World War. He had actually defeated Hitler in a reasonably close presidential election in 1932, but he was an old man. He died in 1934, and Hitler decided to combine his office as Chancellor or Prime Minister with Hindenburg's old office of President. And the official title he took was Führer, which I'm sure, as many of you know, is the German for leader. And what Hitler did in order to kind of win approval or to demonstrate that this was a legitimate act, that this was not simply a power grab, he offered a plebiscite to the German people on whether they approved of his taking of the office of President, combining it with the office of Chancellor, and creating the new office of Führer that essentially was entirely in charge of all aspects of the German government. And 90% of people approved this plebiscite. And I mentioned, going back to, we talked about the French Revolution, how starting with the rise of modern nation states, modern democracy, that plebiscites are also sometimes a tool used by, essentially that the sea change that has taken place since the French Revolution is that all actions that almost every government takes need to look like they are legitimately the will of the people, whether they really are or not. And so this is a good example of this, that Hitler really, there was no one who was going to challenge his rule, but it was important for him to demonstrate, or at least pretend, that this was really something the German people wanted, and that's why he held the plebiscite. One quick comment I want to make about Hitler's leadership before we talk a little bit about the Nazi state is that an interesting contrast between Hitler and Stalin was that Stalin was very much a micromanager. All aspects of the German state, or the Russian state, he controlled very closely. He monitored what everyone was doing. He had very, very detailed plans for each individual aspect of the Soviet Union. Hitler was very different. Hitler, frankly, was quite lazy. And at times was dependent upon, later on in his career, depended on medication and also possibly cocaine to kind of keep his attention during the day. He didn't really attend meetings very often. He often slept late. He was kind of disorganized. And essentially what he did, he created this power vacuum in which people were expected to kind of know what he wanted and to do what they thought he wanted them to do. So we think of the Nazi dictator state as this very, very tightly organized, centralized, minutely managed state. It really wasn't. Not in the same way that the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin was. The Nazi state was a bit more kind of chaotic. There's a famous historian called Ian Kershaw who wrote the two major biographies about Adolf Hitler, and he termed this strategy something called, what he called, working towards the Führer. Basically, what Hitler was kind of expecting is that people would kind of know what he wanted and they would go out and do it. So a lot of agents within the Nazi state kind of had free reign to do whatever they wanted, under the assumption that what they were doing was what Hitler wanted them to do. And if it turned out that Hitler liked what they were doing, then of course they were rewarded. But it also meant that there was great competition within the various aspects of the German state, because Hitler had a very much hands-off role. Different departments, different German or different Nazi agencies fought with one another for resources, for revenue, for tax, in order to implement their own program. So it was very much a totalitarian dictatorship, but in terms of its central vision, was oftentimes chaotically organized. Again, I'm going to talk more about Nazi foreign policy in our next class, and then I'll talk about Nazi policy towards the Jews when we talk about the Holocaust. So we'll talk about more detail of other aspects of Nazi society later on. But just to give you an idea of what was German society like in the 1930s under the Nazis. Some of you are probably familiar with the Hitler Youth movement. That was something the Nazis had established prior to coming to power. But once the Nazis did come to power, it became very, very popular. And by 1936, the Nazis simply made it mandatory for all members of the German young people to join the Hitler Youth. They also sought to exert stringent control over all aspects of the German media. So newspapers, radios, books were all very, very closely censored. The Nazis organised mass book burning parties, where intellectuals whose ideas clashed with what was preached by the Nazis, their works were simply burned. In particular, works by prominent Jewish scholars were often burned as well. And the Nazis sought to use mass media to manipulate the German population into seeing them as a kind of introducing a glorious revolution in Germany. Some of you might be familiar with Leni Riefenstahl, a famous female German movie maker who made several pro-Nazi movies. Maybe the most famous of them was Triumph of the Will, which was about a mass Nazi rally held at Nuremberg in 1935. So the Nazis are trying to control all aspects of German society and create loyalty amongst the different branches of German society, so the youth, adults, workers, whatever it was, and working towards loyalty to Hitler. German women were allowed work to some extent. Some jobs, like working in textile factories, Hitler felt that was women's work anyway, and those jobs were open to women. But the Nazis did try and limit women working in certain capacities. So most public jobs after the Nazis came to power were closed off to women. Most jobs in heavy industry factories were closed off to women. Instead, women were expected to stay at home, to be good mothers, good wives, and to try and breed racially pure children to serve Germany. There was actually a separate movement established for German women, or German teenagers, female teenagers, the League of German Maidens, to again encourage them to see their duty to Germany as to be good wives, good mothers. Separately from this, the Nazis also created a separate program called the Lebensborn, where they took women who they thought displayed particularly Aryan characteristics in terms of blonde hair, blue eyes, and things like that, and encouraged them to sleep with Nazi male officers who had some of those similar characteristics to try and create a new master race of German children. And I think there's estimates that several thousand children were born outside of marriage, so in some ways kind of contradicting the Nazi message about the importance of family, born outside of marriage, but with the idea that they would be a new future ethnically pure Aryan race. Of course, in order to win or to keep popular support, Hitler had to fix the German economy. The German economy was obviously devastated in 1933. By 1933, if Hitler could turn the Nazi economy around, this would ensure that the real loyalty of the German people. And he was able to do so, and largely he was able to do so by engaging in massive public works. So spending huge amounts of public money, building roads, reclaiming land, and more importantly, rearming the German military. Hitler calculated by having this massive stimulus of German government spending, it would help lift all boats in the German economy, as it were. And this is what he did. And of course, I mean, why was he able to do this? Well, basically, he was able to borrow money, knowing he had no intention of paying it back, because he was building towards a war to expand Germany's frontiers in the near future. So, in other words, he was able to borrow public money, plow that into creating new jobs, that firstly government jobs, but that helped lead to a rise of new jobs in private industry as well. But all, of course, is based on borrowing money he has no intention of repaying. Nevertheless, by 1936, Germany had full employment again, from a period when the German economy had been in utter chaos for the previous 15 years. And many people, not surprisingly, thought that Hitler was a genius, an economic genius. He had solved all of Germany's problems. In the textbook, I don't know if you've looked at it, but there's one German woman wrote in her diary in 1937, just to quote, "One feels absolutely insignificant in the face of the greatness, the truthfulness, and the openness of such a man." And so Hitler's loyalty, or the ability of Hitler to win the loyalty of the German people, was very much based on the fact that he was able to turn around the German economy, albeit using kind of not very economically, well, you can argue how economically practical the methods were. It's easy to spend money when you have no intention of repaying the money you borrowed. Nevertheless, by 1936, Hitler had restored the German economy, and there was very few people questioning his rule as dictator. So what we'll look at in our next few classes are German foreign policy, which leads to the Second World War, and then later on German efforts to attack and eliminate the Jews, not just of Germany, but of Europe in its entirety.